Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us today. Today, we're going to be looking at rebuilding trust post-Grenfell. We've got a really distinguished panel of industry experts and, really importantly today, the voice of the residents. And we're going to be taking a view at a look at what the sector could and should be doing, and hopefully coming up with some practical actionable insights for you, as well as some thoughts on where the sector is going. So today is about the residents' voice, rebuilding trust post-Grenfell, looking not just at operational but also philosophical approaches to property management. And as always, a disclaimer, so today is for general information purposes only. It is not and must not be construed as legal guidance or official guidance in any context. And that also helps our panelists to speak freely and to share more of their wisdom and insights with you. And so I'd like to turn to our panelists, and in alphabetical surname order, can I please start with Andrew Bulmer? Could you possibly introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure, and good to be with you today. Andrew Bulmer, Chief Exec of the Institute of Residential Property Management, professional body, 5,500 members, who are mainly property managers managing big, scary residential buildings.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for joining us. Nigel Glen, over to you.
Nigel Glen from ARMA, the Association of Residential Managing Agents. So metrics like Andrew, we have about 330 managing agent firms, about 500 firms in total, and they manage 1.5 million leaseholders.
Thank you very much. Nygel Scourfield.
Hi. So I've enjoyed 40 years of a customer-centric career across various sectors. Fell into property management about 6 years ago. Became MD of First Port and a council member for ARMA, working alongside Nigel. Focused on bringing the customer to the foreground. That's kind of what I think I offer best value for. I'm currently leading an investment fund manager through a sort of very similar journey, and I find working in property a privilege. You know, we manage people's homes. There's nothing more important than that, in my view.
Excellent. Thank you. And Bob.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. I'm Bob Smytherman. I think I'm probably the resident's voice today. I'm a leaseholder. I have been for the last 30 years of a flat in Worthing in West Sussex. For most of that time, I've been a director of the resident management company, which I had my arm twisted at the first AGM I attended. And as a result, I've got interested in property management, and I wanted to share my expertise looking after my own block with the Federation of Private Residence Associations, which is a national voice across England and Wales for similar resident management companies, right to manage companies throughout the country.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. We've got a huge amount to get through today. So without further ado, the first topic is, how is the role of the managing agent changing, particularly in respect of building safety? Nigel Glen, would you like to kick us off on that?
Thanks, Raj. Yeah. I think the first thing to say is building safety has always been very, very important for what building managers do. The subtext at times is we've only just woken up to building safety and looked around and kind of thought, oh gosh, we better get involved in that. That's not the case. We've been doing that from the year dot. But how's that going to change? There's obviously a much greater focus. We've got legislation coming through. There's going to be things in there like the building safety manager. So how we work with the building safety manager is going to be important. I think that will be determined by how large you are. So certainly I know some of the larger firms are thinking of having the building safety manager function internally, whereas others, I had a small firm, I couldn't justify a full-time building safety manager I probably only had one building that would need the attentions currently for that building safety manager. So depending on your size, I think it will affect how you will look at that. We also need to think a bit about proportionality. I was giving evidence to a Welsh Senate inquiry, and to be honest, the way they're looking at safety is any building of 2 dwellings and upwards. So your proverbial conversion with a staircase and a light bulb will be included in that and have requirements about it. So I think there's going to be some issues on that. I mean, we're coming onto that a bit later, but it's going to be a brave new world. There's still quite a lot of fuzz around the edges. The new building safety order is out. There's going to be a lot of consultation about it, but just an increased focus of what we're already doing, I think, is how I'd like to leave it as.
Excellent, thank you. And Andrew, what's your view?
Well, Nigel's right. Safety has always been important. But there's a game-changing shift which is coming down the track, and the phrase that I tend to use is that we're all building safety managers now, lowercase BSM. And the reason for that is that, as Nigel has alluded to, some of the bigger firms especially will have more of a corporate structure for the BSM. Either way, whether you source it externally or whether you have your in-house provision, it will be the day-to-day building manager that will end up carrying out most of the functions of a building manager, a building safety manager, the bicycle in the fire escape, the barbecue on the balcony, the recording of information and keeping records. That will tend to be done by the building manager, we feel. So in that sense, we're all building safety managers now. You won't have the legal responsibility in the same way that that title and the responsibility sits with the BSM, but the functionality will sit with the building manager, and that's part of a culture change. So for me, there's two sides to it. One is the functional point, which I've just alluded to. The other one is the culture change, and that is it comes back to Dame Judith Hackett's point, which is that there has been a systemic failure, and therefore there needs to be systemic change. And if you listen to the Grenfell podcast, I was thinking about this recently. If there's one thing almost I'd employ any building manager to do, it would be to listen to the recent Grenfell podcasts on the inquiry, around about episodes 150, 153, somewhere around there. You're listening to the management company on the stand being interviewed, and you can hear the dysfunctional relationship between the managers and the residents. And it comes back to this trust point, which is there was a total absence of trust on both sides, and it's a very uncomfortable listen because you can hear yourself in both sides of the discussion. And anybody that's got a modicum of empathy, and building managers are good on empathy, but when you've got a modicum of empathy and you listen to that, you suddenly realize how far that relationship had deteriorated and things that were lost as a result. I'm not going to prejudge the inquiry, but I would certainly counsel you to listen to that. So that would be my point.
Excellent, thank you. And Bob, the question I asked was probably misphrased. I asked about how the role of managing agents are changing in respect of building safety, but obviously residents can have significant responsibilities as well. So what's your view on building safety?
Absolutely, and certainly as an RMC director myself, and our sort of fellow colleague RMC directors, RTM directors, and then with the onset of more common hold associations being created, there will be a lot more residents that will be taking on these new responsibilities, and it's really important that actually we use our soft skills to communicate with all our residents the importance of building safety and fire safety being everyone's responsibility. I was very privileged to be involved with the Home Office work, looking at the regulations from the Fire Safety Bill, which is now a 2021 Act, and that is that particular act is going to place a huge amount of additional responsibilities on those of us that manage our properties. Many of us, like me, who do it on a voluntary basis. I do it because I just want my neighbours to be safe. And many of my resident neighbours actually just want whoever it is, whether it be me or whether it be a block where you've got one of Andrew or Nigel's members, they just want them to keep them safe. They don't really care. I was on a very interesting topic a few weeks ago with a resident, and we had a long debate about resident engagement, and we kind of all think we know what we mean by resident engagement, but actually for lots of residents, actually, they don't want to be engaged. They actually want people just to do their job. And I think it's really important that our soft skills, we actually create an environment where there is, as I think Andrew said, that mutual trust to make sure that actually, and as Nigel the Y said, actually, these are our homes. And actually that trust in, making sure that our homes are safe is so important.
Thank you.
Can I just come in on that one? That's an interesting point because sorry, Bob, you said that a whole range of new responsibilities come through. That's correct. The bill will bring in new responsibilities and new obligations. But what it's also going to do, it's going to crystallise existing ones. Nigel Glen started off by saying we've always been interested in building safety, and both senses are right. This new legislation will crystallise, and it will. We are going to see for the first time some of those responsibilities that to date we've kind of not been clear on and shied away from a little bit. So I want to come away from the idea that all of this is completely new. There's a new regime, but those responsibilities, the potential for ending up in court, have always been there.
Thank you. And so what we're hearing is that it's more of the same. So building safety has always been a critical part of a property manager's role, or if a resident has responsibilities. But interestingly there, Bob, you touched on the softer skills. Nigel with a Y, as you were referred to. You mentioned your long-standing career in customer-centric roles. How do you view customer engagement and resident engagement forming part of this trust rebuild?
I mean, so in my view, our job is to kind of bridge the gap between building safety and all the words that have just been talked through, and then also the recent resident experiences. So we haven't all been worrying the last 12 months about building safety. Many of us have been worrying about the environment. Many of us have been worrying about our health. Nobody would have thought a year ago that we were going to go into a lockdown and experience the 12 months that we have. So I think as building managers responsible for the safety is entirely correct. But what we need to do is as Bob's just alluded to, home has never been so top of mind. And home for some people in the last 12 months has been their sanctuary. For many of us, it's been our office. For a lot of people, it's been the restaurant. It's been those special meals that you've tried to create to because you couldn't go out. It's been the gym. People have used their spaces to keep fit, and for some it's been their prison, because they couldn't do the things they wanted to do, and because they feel completely trapped in their building because there's a cladding issue, they can't sell their property. So there are many different aspects to home, and I think our job is to focus on creating the living aspect of the home. Join the dots up. Try and rebuild that trust, the reality of that trust, to make people's lives easy to live in their homes. And as Bob's just alluded to, they don't really want extra rules. They just want to know that they can live without anxiety in their home. That I think is our job, to make that possible.
Brilliant, thank you. And Nigel with a Y, I'm going to stay with you for the next part because I think it plays into what you've just said. So some residents may, and indeed I'd be confident saying some residents have lost confidence in landlords and managing agents, particularly those that have been badly affected by cladding remediation, external wall surveys. How can their landlord and managing agent now rebuild trust from that position?
Yeah, I think the number one fact is we need to think long term. So when we rushed into changing cladding and realized that we didn't actually improve the EPC ratings of the building when we did it, that was us not really thinking through the long-term implications. Nobody could have forgiven us for the health aspects. Nobody would have anticipated what was going to come over the last 12 months. But we have got to get better at joining the dots and stop thinking in silos. Start really working together on what are the big challenges if you're living in a building, and it will be about EPC and it will be about safety, and those two agendas definitely can fit together. Just before the meeting started, we were talking about electric cars. There's another challenge that we need to consider. So building managers need to be really thinking long term. Find ways to be consistent. So find metrics that we can talk about for a long period of time. It's not easy in the UK at the moment because the press are putting out so many different sets of numbers that diminishes trust in people with authority. So our job is to make the language that we use easy, and to make sure that the things that we can talk about for a long period of time, and then we don't contradict ourselves, because that's really important. Understand not only the blocks that we manage, but understand the local community needs, because you can't divorce one from the other. Our customers live in their homes in communities, and the builders talk about building communities, and our job is to make sure that we understand the implications of communities on this subject.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to hand over to Bob in a second, but just as a reminder to everyone, if you have any comments, insights, challenges or even questions are very gratefully received, could you please click on the Q&A button in the Zoom panel above, and we've got time allocated at the end for audience questions. We've already received a few in advance. Bob, from your perspective, how can trust be rebuilt? Or I guess more broadly, as the voice of the residents on today's panel, how can trust be rebuilt?
I think that's a really, really big question, Raj. I think, it has to be about communication. It has to be communicating in ways in which people want to be communicated to. My block that I'm a director of, we've got 46 flats. I've got some people that that won't hesitate to phone me round the clock when they've got a problem. I've got others that will be absolutely horrified if I even dared to knock on their door and ask to inspect the state of their fire door opening and things like that. So it really is about knowing your residents and communicating it in a way that works for everybody, really, and having the tools to do so. We're very blessed in this digital world that we've all become accustomed to over the last year or so, with a whole range of online tools that are available. And at the FPRA, our members have got access to many of those facilities in which we can support residents groups to engage both with each other and their landlord, their managing agent. But communication has to be the real biggest key to rebuilding trust, I think.
Thank you. Andrew, what's your take on rebuilding trust, and do you have anything particularly on the EWS process that you'd like to add in?
Okay, I'll try and come back to EWS if I can. I can see there's a question that's come in on that. I would pick up first of all on Bob's point about communication. If you look at the IRPM qualifications, it used to be all technical content. More recently, they've moved to modules on ethics and behaviours, on customer service, which communications is a big part. I think for me, if you're going to build confidence, then there's the old truism of say what you do and do what you say. Well, that's communication and performance. But if you then if you communicate, and communication is two-way, it's listen as well as speak and through the various channels. Then if you do that in an ethical way, and if you don't breach the trust of the expectations of the customers, then ultimately you will gain confidence, and it's a long haul. Anybody that's been in any relationship knows that you can blow trust, overnight, and it can take a lifetime to come back again, and it may never come back. So it's going to be a long row to hoe for some of our customers. But let's not be all negative about it. Some of our customers are behind what you do. I go back to the Grenfell thing again. There were customers that were pleased with the way the managing agent was dealing with things as well. It's going to be a long journey. I think the other thing is going to be the building safety regulator. The regulator is going to bring proportionality, that's the hope, into the regime, and proportionality in a safety regime should bring confidence in the regime. And if as part of doing that, it also delivers that culture change that we've talked about, where safety first and everybody thinks about it as an agenda, then again, I think there will be increased confidence, and with that confidence will come trust. You mentioned the EWS one. I think it's a bit of an example of where trust can break down through lack of communication and misunderstanding. The EWS one did not cause the cladding crisis, nor did it cause flats to not go on for sale. You had mortgage lenders who wanted to know what the builders had put on the building, and the EWS one form was a device to provide that information. All the EWS one form simply crystallized the problem, but the poor communication that sat around it has meant that we've got people all over the piece being super stressed about it, and when all it's really done is just highlighted the problem that actually we were already stuck with.
Thank you. And Nigel Glen, what's your take on rebuilding trust?
Trust is a very difficult thing to gain and very easy to lose, as Andrew says. I remember when I moved from being an RMC director to becoming a property manager with my own firm, I was horrified, I think is the only word I can use, about how my fellow directors turned on me within a couple of weeks, because they just saw me as a managing agent and somebody to be beaten up, quite frankly. There's inherent problems in our industry. There's I've spoken about it before, we have this rather strange pricing mechanism, which means that firms have to spread their building property managers out really, really, really thin, because that's the only way to actually even try and keep your nose above water. That's a long-term thing. Shorter term, though, I mean, I want to stand up for property managers here. There's been a huge amount of work, and maybe one problem is we haven't actually told anybody about that. So we haven't let residents and leaseholders know what we've been up to. You know, we stand up every now and again in front of various bits of media, and Andrew and I do this, but it's all we do. I mean, for the last 2 or 3 years, I'm sure I speak for Andrew, this is all I do is cladding and try and help the leaseholders, but we don't tell people about that. So that's our own fault, and something that it requires an ARMA and IRPM to do something about that. I'll come back to what Bob was saying, which was we meet with the cladding action groups on a regular basis, and hopefully that will help trickle down from them to their residents and leaseholders, that actually these managing agents are trying their best to help the leaseholders. But communication comes up every single time. And I know I'm just repeating what Bob has said, but it is just so key. I'll give you an example. Somebody was complaining that all they heard was the Section 20 process, and I talked to the managing agent. And they said, "Well, that's the requirement." But Section 20 isn't really a communication. It's a league going to do something, and frankly, you don't have much say in it. You know, communication is a long-term thing. Another example: when I had my firm, a lift broke down, and I said to the guys, "When's the part coming?" And as always with the lifts, it takes 3 weeks to come from Finland. And after a week, I said, "How's it going? And have you let them know? And have you let the leaseholders know that the lift is still a couple of weeks away?" No, I told them last week it's 3 weeks. And it's kind of, well, they're sitting there wondering if it's still 3 weeks. Honestly, you will save time if you just ping them a quick, "It's still 2 weeks from now," rather than just assume that they're sitting there kind of going, "We've been told a week ago, we know that's tickety-boo." So do think about that. And if I can come back to something that Nigel with a Y said, it's so easy as property managers to see a block as a thing. You know, it needs a new boiler, it needs painting, it needs gardening done, it needs a concierge. And I do it. When I talk to government or insurers about blocks, it's, the average cost to remediate is 2 million. What's important is then to get it back to, but per flat, i.e. the person who lives in that home, and call it a home, not a flat actually, if you can, that means it's gone up £1,000 each in terms of insurance. It's £25,000 that person has to find, because it is their homes, it is personal. And if you can try and think of, I know it's very easy to say, but if I were in their shoes, what would I want back? I know time is precious, but that will save you time in the long run. So I'm quite emotional about that, because you just have to listen to a few of these leaseholder things. It's not the property manager's fault. Let's be absolutely clear about that. Leaseholders are a wounded animal biting back. I understand that. I know it's tough on property managers, but put yourself in their shoes. Soapbox over.
Thank you. And so today's about rebuilding trust. What can we do? And a key theme that keeps coming through is communication. So communication is the start to rebuilding trust. And communication, as Andrew rightly pointed out, is a two-way exercise. And as Nigel pointed out, it's premised on empathy, but sort of bring it back to a more basic question, perhaps, which is buildings themselves are different and are also getting more complex with more complex setup, so mixed use or more complex M&E within them, and residents themselves are different, and so they have different needs in terms of communication. So what's an effective way to consistently understand who the residents are or who occupies the building, and how should one or would one communicate with them? And so Bob, from your perspective, how does this all fit together?
Yeah, I think Roger, I think for us, this is our sort of core business, really, as the Federation of Private Residents Associations. It's about encouraging our neighbours in our homes, in our blocks, to come together to form a residents association, if that's appropriate, seek recognition from our landlord, if that's appropriate. But actually, if you're like in my block, where you're a shareholder in the RMC, the resident management company, then actually come together with your fellow neighbours, act in a coherent way, in a democratic way. I'm elected every year by my residents. We insist on having a public annual general meeting. Where all the residents, I invite the tenants as well, because actually we've got about 50% subtenants have got a stake in in their homes because they're paying a rent. And I try to involve everyone as much as possible. We produced a very helpful document online, which enables people to understand how you could, if you need a residents association, how you can form one. There's sort of template letters about how that can happen. The government have made some of that simpler by kind of knowing who's in particular in people's homes. One of the things that's become very difficult over the last year or so is the rise of Airbnb, where actually, our homes actually are now our hotels, and actually, people are renting out their properties for people to stay for a week, and obviously, if you're faced with managing the block and understanding your block, you might not have a clue from 1 week to the next who's in your block. So it's about understanding who's in your block and having the processes and the soft skills to sort of to work through that, really.
Brilliant, thank you. And thank you also for signposting where people can get some assistance. Nigel with a Y, what's your take on the communication exercise?
I mean, a lot of this has already been said, so I'm not going to regurgitate what's all, there's some big wise words talked already. But I think we do need to learn new habits. I think reflecting as individual companies, just what habits can you really form that recognize that customers don't just want to be spoken to. I think we're all clear on that. They want to be spoken to on their terms. And Andrew mentioned earlier that communication is a two-way thing. It's about listening and it's about being clear on the words that you use. And I think I would say, don't try and become the policeman of the building, because that's not what property managers need to be. It feels a bit like sometimes we're the policeman of the building, but I think that's a bit of a lose-lose. And then the other big message I would give is, choose your contractors that you work with wisely. Use companies that are alive to the needs of your customers, because they'll really help you gain trust. As a property manager, you might visit your building and you might see your customers once every 2 or 3 months. But you've got contractors that are possibly there every week. And sometimes I don't think we speak enough to our contractors to help us with the journey of rebuilding trust in general. So I think, think about the contractors you use. There's some fantastic contractors out there. Go and find them.
It's brilliant, really interesting to view the contractors or the people who visit site, whether they're contractors or cleaning staff or landscape gardeners or whatever it is, as the extensions of the brand and the key physical interaction point with residents, but also the need for what many people call omni-channel, multiple ways in which residents can communicate and choose to be communicated with as the sector evolves. Andrew, what's your take on this?
Well, first of all, I'll pick up on the comment about the contractors being your representatives. I think that's a light bulb moment. I really do. I like that very much. I want to take issue slightly with your question. The cookie cutter approach to managing fire safety will not cut it anymore. I think especially when it comes down to safety, I'm a big fan of consistent approaches. So by cookie cutter, I mean, I think I would interpret that as being a sort of a blind and unthinking approach. You just run the system without actually looking at the building that you're managing and the people and the homes that you are working with. So I agree with the sort of the underlying sentiment behind the question, but I would argue that consistency of process is a fairly important thing to make sure that you don't drop off. When an airline pilot sits at the sharp end before they take off, they still use a checklist. And they still make sure that they don't miss stuff. So consistency for me, I think, is an important thing. We're waiting for the draft building safety bill to come out. It was rumoured to be out later this week. Then it was rumoured to be out yesterday. We're all on tenterhooks. And that's going to shine a light on some of the obligations of the building safety manager. But as I understand it, managing agents will have a duty to take account of residents' needs if the residents approach you to say, I have needs. You need to make you are likely to need to make yourself available so residents know how to have that conversation with you, to know that they can have that conversation with you. But if a resident does not wish to have that conversation with you, then you are not, I believe, going to be obliged to push and try and understand whether somebody is in a wheelchair when they're not prepared to say so, or they've got a visual impairment or what have you. Knowing your resident, yes. Being available for residents to talk to you, and letting them have the confidence to have that conversation with you, yes. But I don't think that a building manager is going to have to know everybody who's in every unit every night of the week. I don't think it's neither practical nor possible.
Thank you very much. The really interesting that you ended on what is practical and possible. Nigel Glen, what's your view?
Yeah, following on from Andrew, what's the practical and possible? That's one of the things that we do try and get across to government when we're talking to them, because, you know, certainly in urban areas, over 50% of flats are generally buy to let. And anybody who's a property manager knows it's hard enough to know who owns the flat, let alone who lives in it. You know, normally you find out that a flat's being sold only because you send the service charge demand to the old owner, who gives you a rather robust and fruity letter back saying, you idiot, I sold it 2 months ago. So it's very difficult to know who's actually in there. So there has to be a clear responsibility on, to my mind, the only person who does know who's in it really, who is the owner of the flat. They know who they have let it out to. It'll never be perfect. So I've been on meetings with government and the fire brigade, for example, where they say you have to have 100% knowledge of who's in the flats. And we're going, you can't get that. If that's mandatory, we should walk away now, because some landlords will actively shield that they're renting out. They don't want to pay a subletting fee. They don't want to let the revenue know that they're getting money in and so forth. So we're going to have to work together, but it will be on both sides. There will need to be some accountability on the flat owners as well as the managing agents. It's not fair, reasonable, proportional to shove everything on the managing agent saying this is your baby from now on. So it is going to be very interesting to see how we can work together. And there are examples of this. You look at Strata in Australia and the Queensland model. It's really, really interesting, I find, where the managing agent frankly holds the AGM. Anything over and above that is chargeable in little 6-minute chunks, and it's up to their version of the Commonwealth Association to say, actually, we'll do it all ourselves and send you the bills, or we want you to do it because we don't have the time or the inclination to do it. So I think there's some flexibility in models working in how we can work together going forward as well. That's my bit on the residents, though. You know, dear government, please, we don't actually know who the residents are, which is a bit of a shame, but it's very hard to see that changing.
Brilliant, thank you. And thank you to everyone who submitted a question, a comment, or an insight so far, whether before today's webinar or during it. There's still time if there's anything you'd like to pose to the panel before we close off the Q&A and bring it to the audience questions, the moderated audience questions. So if there's anything you would like to pose, please stick it in the Q&A panel right now, or as soon as you can, and we'll start collating those. So one of the themes was communication, which we've talked about. Another one is collaboration, so working together. So residents, and if there's a managing agent in place, working in harmony, or residents together working in harmony. A lot's been talked about responsibilities, but sometimes the residents themselves are the people who are best placed to prevent or mitigate risk. So what can we do to make sure everyone knows what they should and shouldn't do? Nigel with a Y, would you like to kick us off on this?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of learnings coming out from working groups that I've attended over the last 2 or 3 years. Interestingly, the ones I think I've learned the most from have been from social housing, because they have a spirit that talks of community engagement rather than individual residents, particularly. And I think that there's a lot to be said for the way in which social housing approaches community engagement. And I'd imagine everybody on the call knows somebody either directly or indirectly in social housing, and there's some brilliant housing association best practice guides. I think now's the time to just broaden horizons a bit, to think how we can generally engage not just individuals but communities as a whole. And then I think the other thing that I learned during that process, and I'm probably relearning it, is to use simple images, simple signage to communicate what it is you want to do, not lots of words. And has already been said, there's lots of people going into buildings that are not necessarily the residents of those buildings. And if everybody had a bit more awareness about fire safety, if everybody had a bit more awareness about trip hazards, you could imagine that the world would improve a bit. And rather than think about all the hundreds of pages of communication that might go out, I think simple signage might help every single building. There's some really good signs on the ARMA website for those members of ARMA, and they've been done over a period of time with some of the housing associations as well as Hampshire Fire Brigade. So I would go and find ways of communicating in a really simple way. Remember, the community is multicultural, but it's also multi-able, and it's very much multi-willing. So the easier you make it, the more likely that we're going to get better quality engagement.
Brilliant, thank you. Nigel Glen, what's your take on resident engagement and the resident responsibility, perhaps?
Well, Nigel with a Y and Nigel with an I, we both went on this social group, and it was really, really interesting because they ran a lot of pilots on this. It wasn't just people sitting around sort of thinking, what do you think we should do? So they did trials and tested things and went back afterwards for retention. And so we've stolen, to be quite honest, some of their ideas on that one with their permission. For example, everybody says, oh, I don't do snail mail, emails and texts. That's what I want to receive. Whereas when they actually studied it about who paid attention, but more importantly, who remembered it weeks afterwards, good old snail mail was way, 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 way better than the other way. So it's kind of interesting from that point of view. I think it's a fundamental shift in how people think about it. I mean, we've all had barbecues and balconies, if those of us who lived in flats, because that's what you do, isn't it? In the summer, it's a lovely day, you're outside. What could be the harm in that? We need to start to get people to change that. And I hate to keep throwing stuff at government, but I think if you think back to when I was a kid, clunk click. So I used to, when I was learning to drive a car, if you wore a seatbelt, you were a wimp. That's not what macho kids did. You're a hard man if you drive without a seatbelt. Now, I wouldn't dream of it. You get in the car and somebody doesn't put the seatbelt on, you instantly kind of go, oh, don't forget your belt. And the other person doesn't go, you wimp. They kind of go, oh, yep, thank you, and put it in. It needs that sort of cultural change because fires start almost always in flats. So I think there is a lot of work to do, and it won't be overnight, but that's how we will sort of crack this, working together with residents, helping educate them, either ourselves or the government, just helping people to understand how life will be better if they follow the sort of simple social rules.
Thank you very much. I hadn't heard of Clunk Click before, but I'm going to look it up on YouTube, assuming it was a video.
You swine.
And with that, I'm going to hand over to Andrew. What's your view?
Clunk Click is an interesting one because it was a repeated simple message. By the way, I've seen an interesting question coming from Dave Clark, and I'll probably pick up on that as part of this. People ignore flight safety briefings now. We all get on a plane, we're all familiar with this. I mean, in fairness, most of us could probably mimic, the exits at the front, over the wing, and at the back. But there's somewhere on YouTube, there's an interesting video of one of the flight attendants who decided to do it in rap. And he absolutely smacked it, and the whole aircraft gave him a round of applause at the end of it. And what he was actually doing was taking something which was serious, and he was delivering it in a way that was different and fun, and it got people's attention, and they actually paid attention instead of reading the in-flight magazine or wondering how many gin and tonics they could get down before they landed. And it's just an interesting way of looking at how we do what we do and thinking about how can we communicate this in a better way. But that is putting the onus, as the question says, on the landlord and the block manager. I'm going to leave it to Bob actually to come back. He was in the same meeting as me, and we had an interesting one about residents saying that they don't want to be engaged with. But I think we have to be courageous enough to say there are some people that don't want to be engaged, and we then unilaterally, and it does come back to the manager, have to think about how we can communicate in really simple, consistent, repeated messages so that the bare essentials just get through as a matter of instinct in the same way as we can repeat a flight safety briefing. David Clark did just say one interesting thing though in his question, which was the obsessive and continued reliance on property managers to do this, continued failure to learn and continue to fail customers. Who has customer voice represented at board level? And what do the panel think organisations should be doing that will give real voice to customers? I think they're really good challenges. I mean, IRPM has put a customer voice on our board at board level. for example. But I think that's a good challenge that, you know, when we're having this conversation now, when we talk about property managers, the IRPM membership goes from students to CEOs, and I think we're talking to everyone. I think everyone at every point in an organisation is part of this conversation.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to come back to that actually, because I think that's, so I'd love to hear everybody else's views on the governance piece of this and how the resident voice is put at the heart of the agenda for managing agents. Bob, over to you. What's your view on, I guess, resident engagement? Nigel Glen already highlighted that the majority of flat fires start within demises, but some residents don't want to be engaged with. How do we overcome that? What should we do?
I think that's absolutely right, and I think goes back to the point I raised earlier about talking to them on the terms that they want to be engaged with. And you know, and obviously I'm chairman of my management company. A lot of my residents, they don't want to engage with me, but actually they might engage with one of my directors who kind of lives, you know, in the same block as them, or back to the Nigel's earlier point about contractors. You know, contractors are a really, really important point. As a self-managed block, one of the things that I find really works very well for us is actually one of our directors is also a buy-to-let landlord who actually now does our gardening as well. He does our routine maintenance. It's all completely transparent. It's published what we pay him for, but actually he's a friendly face on site that people want to have a conversation with. So I think, you know, it's about, you know, whatever works for every block. No two blocks are the same. I think one of the things, as chairman of the FPRA, I've been involved with the FPRA now for about 15 years. When I go back sort of 15 years ago, whether it's because I was a new, fresh, annoying face or not, actually a lot of organisations didn't want to engage with us. They saw us as the enemy. You know, actually, I now get invited to wonderful things like this, Raj. You know, I do regular things with Andrew and IRPM on the well-being of their block managers. We've got a better relationship now than we've ever had with ARMA since Nigel Glen's been involved at the top. And I'm not just saying that because they're on the screen. I genuinely mean that. You know, and actually, I think, you know, it's not seeing people like us as, you know, the other side or the enemy or anything like that. You know, living in a block, you know, block of flats, we are all in it together. Whether, you know, whether you're a tenant, whether you're a long leaseholder, whether you're the managing agent, whether you're the investor freeholder, we've all got a relationship, and we need to make sure that we sort of gel those together. And I'm very, very optimistic about the future. I've never been invited to so many things in the last year that I have at the moment since leasehold reforms come on the agenda, whether it's the work around the Fire Safety Act, whether it's the work around the Building Safety Regulator. I've got a meeting tomorrow. You know, 10, 15 years ago, actually, nobody kind of really understood what we did. But, you know, because obviously, you know, as of the Federation of Private Residence Associations, often we wear two hats, and it's not always an easy thing to explain. You know, people think we're, you know, the voice of leaseholders. Yes, we are the voice of leaseholders in my case, but actually, you know, as an RMC director, I've got responsibilities to my other leaseholders as well. You know, and it's important that I take those responsibilities seriously.
Thank you. We're going to come on to the audience questions, and I'm going to start with one that Andrew sort of touched on, which is, through this we've had various themes, and I think they're going to come through in the question. One of which is property managers don't really manage properties, they manage people, and it's about the communication and the trust with those people. How can or should managing agents put the voice of those people, so the voice of the customer, at the heart of what they do from a governance perspective? Does anyone want to share a view or explain what they've seen to get the voice of the customer up to board level and as central to the thinking of managing agents?
Can I start that one?
Of course.
So certainly in my time with Firstport, but also my time with ARMA, you know, our job was to tell stories that customers have told them. And, you know, human beings from the beginning of time, you know, we learn from telling stories. And I think our job as individuals on any board is to be very aware of the stories that your customers are experiencing. So bringing things alive, being practical, being human, makes decisions that you take in a boardroom significantly better. And it doesn't need to be an appointment of a customer voice director. It needs to be the leaders of the business, the chief execs, being really clear that on every board meeting, you need to talk about something you've experienced about customer. It might be a problem that you haven't solved. It could be a problem you have solved. It could be just an observation. But that storytelling aspect of a board meeting is invaluable. So I would say make time to tell stories.
I'd agree with Nigel. Like, one of the best jobs I ever did was working for BP. So I was in headquarters in London when I was my first job, and then they threw me out to Australia. And my first job was to run 20 petrol stations. So landed, keys to a car, and a mobile phone was given to me, and off I went. And I was loathing it. I thought this was going to be a terrible job. It's the best thing I ever did, because it influenced everything I did in BP from that point on, which is, it's very easy to sit in an ivory tower and say, we're going to double everybody's rents out in the petrol stations because that makes an economic return of 15%, discounted cash flow, all of that. But I'd be sitting there thinking, Jesus, if I was standing in front of Bill Strinsos on his forecourt trying to tell him this, how would this come across? And what's that going to mean to his life? Will it mean, a significant change such that he will leave, so we're not in partnership anymore because I'm frankly just making his business unviable? So getting that touch, I think, is really, really important. And I know Dave has put down there that execs aren't involved. They are. I mean, Andrew and I sit on weekly meetings where the CEOs of the larger firms all get together. Perhaps what they don't do is every now and again go and talk to a leaseholder. I know it's very hard when you're running a large organization. You talk to groups of them, obviously, but trying to get that face-to-face could be something that might help. And as Nigel says, Nigel with a Y, it gives you the story, because it's quite easy in a sense to be buffeted from that or blanketed from that by being two or three steps away.
Perfect. I'm going to move on. We've got quite a few questions that are coming in. And so the next theme that's come up has come from the point that's been expressed a few times, which is that the majority of fires and danger come from within flats. So there are two aspects that have come out of this. The first is there a better alternative way of understanding who is within buildings? And so we're talking here about rented properties in particular, so properties that are under ASTs, like a registration system for landlords and tenants, similar to what occurs in Ireland. And then the second aspect is what can be done to mitigate the risk within flats themselves, whether from an electrical safety or other perspective. What can be done to increase the standards of safety within the flats to better preserve the safety of the building as a whole? Would anyone like to pick up on Nigel Glen?
Yeah, I'm going to warn Andrew, I'm going to throw over to him UPRN, so he can take that one in a second. But I think there are things we can look at. We already do EPCs on flats when you're renting out. The concept of I have come across again on the Welsh, the idea that you would do a fire risk assessment, a professional fire risk assessment inside every flat every year. Again, when we get down to what's practical and proportional, that fire risk assessor will be living on site on big blocks and never get into all of them. But if you could link it to something else, so that when you rent out or when you sell, for example, that you need to get a fire risk assessment where somebody can come in and say, you've taken down this wall, which is there as fire stoppage, so you need to put that back, etc., etc. That could possibly help as well. There will be, there has to be a bit of a carrot and stick there. I know that some people will howl in outrage at the concept of a stick, but I'm afraid sometimes you do have to push some people who really don't want to get engaged with said stick. Hopefully most people go to the carrot. But I think there's ways that we can look at that to try and do that. Andrew, I know I've dumped you in at the UPRN, but hopefully you'll be able to pick that one up professionally. Your microphone's ceased.
Yeah, you see, that's because I'm not professional. No, it's absolutely fine. Knowing who is in a building and should there be a register of tenants was kind of one of the questions. That's an interesting one. Do we actually need to know who is in a building, or do we need to know if we have exceptions to our process in a building? So, for example, the building has evacuate rather than stay put. Do we need to know who is in, or do we need to know those that can't get out? So I'm not sure. I mean, it would be really good to have perfect data about everything, but we have to eat our elephant in chunks. And I think one of the things that would be really helpful actually is not so much to have a register of tenants, but to have a register of landlords. And by that, I mean flat owners who are letting. In fact, and that goes across the whole of the private rented sector, flats or houses for that matter. I have long argued for a light touch, and I do mean light touch. I don't mean a mega bureaucratic thing. Register of landlords, because if you do that, there's a few things. First of all, you can then government policymakers can then communicate with landlords on their responsibilities. You can very simply remind them of things that they need to do. That line of communication opens up dramatically when you know who they are. And at the moment, government haven't got a clue who lets properties. So by doing that, you can then also, that landlord, I mean, they think they're just letting their flat out, but actually they are doing it in the course of business. They do have responsibilities. Once they start taking money for something, at that point, the responsibilities come onto them. And they should be, at that point, they should be driving safety into who's there. And we don't know who they're going to let it to. Are they going to do Airbnb? Are they doing longer term tenants? It's up to them. To take some responsibility for the safety of what goes on in the flat. And that can be done, I think, through a register of landlords far more easily. But I talked about light touch, and I'll segue back into the UPRN. The UPRN is a unique property reference number, and it is attached to every flat, every block, not just every estate, but every block within it, and also every gas meter and bus shelter and other smaller items. And if we're going to have Dame Judith Hackett's golden thread of safety information that comes from design through construction into management, and then as a block manager, we're going to become the post box par excellence. We're going to be like Santa's post room at Christmas, because we're going to be providing certain types of information to leaseholders, to when the leaseholder sells it, to their selling agent, to the buyer's solicitor, to the buyer's lender, to the buyer's valuer, to the buyer themselves. If the buyer becomes a landlord, then that's got to cascade down to the letting agent, and then from there down to the tenant. So there's this boatload of information that we're going to be posting out to all sorts of different people. And we are pushing hard, and we've got traction now. We do know that Pincher MP has heard the message loud and clear that by nailing the UPRN, this little identifier to the different data sets as they come down through history, and if we are then working with the likes of, I won't say, our property management systems, it's going to be a lot easier to tag data and to disseminate data and to make it available through APIs. So clever techie people like Rajiv can create systems whereby when a tenant goes in, the information that they need just lands with them. So the UPRN campaign, if you haven't heard about it, look on the website. It's developing traction. And thank you for the plug, Nigel.
So, thank you. And Bob, I saw that you had your hand raised.
Yeah, just to come back on the registers of landlord, it's always great to hear when colleagues support something like that. I've been a local authority councillor for the last 20 years, and I was really enthused a few years ago when the government proposed a national register of landlords, and then got cold feet for various reasons. And a number of local authorities have tried to introduce a local scheme. I proposed a local scheme some time ago on my local council. It never happened. There was a huge amount of resistance from what were called small amateur landlords. These are people who actually bought their homes, understandably, to benefit their future pension. But actually, with that comes responsibility, and actually, why they shouldn't appear on a register was completely beyond me. I think it does need to be done on a national scale. I think some local authorities have stepped up to do it, with varying degrees of success or otherwise. But I think there does need to be a national register. So I think that's really important. But and I know as part of the Home Office work, they're working on the what they call the PEEPs, which is the personal emergency plans. There's the debate about should somebody who considers themselves to be vulnerable, should we as property managers know about it? And one of the points that I raised to the Home Office was actually people who are vulnerable living in their flats are just happy living in their flats. They don't consider themselves to be vulnerable. So actually, it comes back to kind of knowing your residents, knowing who's in the properties, and understanding them really, rather than kind of, as government tend to want to do, just kind of label people really. But I think it's a really, really important issue.
Brilliant. Thank you. We've got time for a quick wrap up from each of you. So if there's anything that you would like to share with the audience, final points, please raise it now. Nigel Scourfield, is there anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think, just think homes and community rather than blocks and buildings, and you've had lots of examples in the last hour that sort of bring that to life. Think long term, think about the challenges that the next 12 months and the next 2 years are going to bring, particularly with EPC. And then I would be really clear on the partners that you use. Why are you using those partners? How can they really help you win trust? And I don't just mean the contractors on site, but I mean in general the partners that you use as a business. And I think the signage is a way forward. It works for roads and road safety, and it should be working for buildings and building safety as well. So nobody wants any more surprises. So let's just keep things as simple and easy to understand as possible.
Brilliant. Thank you. Nigel Glen.
3 words: communication, 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 to paraphrase Tony Blair. It will say, I know it's a pain to do it when you're 5 o'clock in the evening, you want to go home and it's just that one more thing to send out, but it will save you time in the long run and build the trust and the communication with your leaseholders that you absolutely have to have. So that is just the thing that has come across so strongly when talking to cladding action groups.
Thank you. And Bob, what would you like to leave with the audience?
Just think of your neighbours. These are our homes. Think of your neighbours. Get together, form a residents association if you haven't got one already. We've got lots of resources on our website, fpra.org.uk. Drop us an email. We're here to help. We've got lots of experience. It's our 50th anniversary this year, and we've got lots of experience supporting leaseholders coming together, engaging with their fellow leaseholders, and having positive relationships with our landlords and managing agents.
Amazing. Thank you. And Andrew.
Okay, a lot of my thunder's been stolen, especially around homes and communications. From there, then I would go that the new regime is going to clarify and crystallize responsibilities. And I think if that's going to make us feel more comfortable, because at least we know where we are. And then we build better knowledge around that, better competency around that. That's going to make us feel more comfortable in our shoes. Yeah, I would leave it there. I think there's hope coming down the track. We will have crystallized responsibilities, and we will be able to build both our knowledge and also our business practices around that. And I think we will see some shift in the way that the businesses use property managers to greater effect in terms of communications with and relationships with residents.
Brilliant.
Raj, can I just chip in something which I was remiss not to mention? It's all very well me sitting here sort of pontificating about communication from the white ivory tower of ARMA, but we are trying to do something about that. So Andrew and I and our respective organizations have been working hard on coming up with communications that our respective members can use. Obviously having the brand of ARMA and IRPM will depersonalize it. So if a leaseholder is having a difficult time with their managing agent, and if they get a communication from them, they might kind of go, oh, it's just them trying something on here. Whereas if it comes from a third party, it's no, this is what the sector as a whole thinks that will help. So there is quite a lot. We are working on a lot of communications that we will be very shortly making available to both sets of members. So we're not just sitting here sort of banging a drum and wagging our finger. We are trying to help as well.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you all very, very much for sharing your time and insights with everybody. Thank you to everyone in the audience for attending today's webinar. If you could take 5 seconds at the end just to provide some feedback, we would be hugely grateful. If you'd like to keep up to date with the webinar series that we've been running and will continue to run, please follow us on all good social media channels. If you have any suggestions for topics or themes, please email us at research@fixflo.com. And the next webinar in the series is our next quarterly legal and compliance update with Cass and Ellie, looking at everything weird, wonderful and insightful around the world of law and compliance for block managers. So with that, I'd like to thank you all very much for giving up your time. Thank you very, very much to all the panelists, and I wish you a wonderful day. Thanks.